Good afternoon and welcome to Pop the Red Pill, podcast about truth and everything parental alienation. We are here to lift the veil. My name is Kim McCord and this is my co-host Karen Belcourt. I'd like to start with a very important statistic. Contrary to what we've all been watching on social media over the last 8 to 10 weeks, this statistic is true. 97% of all abuse allegations reported by women are legitimate. Let me repeat that again. 97% of all abuse allegations reported by women are legitimate. That means only 3% are false. And I think we all know who I'm talking about when we say the 3%. Moving on. Our guest today is known for unleashing superhero survivors of abuse, using trauma-informed, survivor-centered advocacy while equipping the community for effective response to family violence.
Kathy has helped clients in multiple US states, Canada, Great Britain, Israel, Netherlands, Australia, Puerto Rico, Yemen, Italy, and Denmark. Please welcome Mother Justice herself, Kathy Jones.
Oh, it's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
We're very happy to have you here today, Kathy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Kathy, I understand that you actually do have an actual superhero cape and boots. Is that true?
It is true. I brought them with me.
Oh my God. Let's see.
A superhero with liberty and justice for all is what the skirt says.
You take your role very seriously.
I do. I take it very seriously.
That's wonderful.
I even have hot pants. That's it, with liberty and justice for all. But the piece de resistance, of course, are the boots.
Oh,
the boots
those are purple boots. Correct?
Purple, knee-high go-go boots.
You know what, Kathy? Keeping this light and making it fun when this is a topic that is so darn dark, good for you. And that's what we all need to do. Thank you for setting that excellent example.
Exactly. I was going to just say the same thing myself. You know, in dealing with so much heaviness, you're absolutely right, Kim. And bless you, Kathy, for building that into, who you are and how you support people.
Yeah. Well, a couple of thoughts behind that. Of course, in 25 years, I have attended just hundreds and hundreds of hours of training on domestic violence, right? And of course, it is a heavy topic and not one that is conducive to laughing and hilarity. But one of the most effective trainings I've ever attended was by a batterer intervention program trainer by the name of David Garvin. And he's out of, I want to say, Michigan. And he had the audience in stitches. And I think that when you're able to laugh about such a difficult topic, that when you're training people, that those trainings just kind of absorb easier, and people are more prone to hearing and opening up about what you have to say, because of course domestic violence is a very polarizing topic and not easily done with laughter. So and then why the superhero costume? Well, my daughters are always telling me how proud they are of me and how wonderful I am and whatever. And one Christmas, my youngest daughter drew me as a superhero. That was my Christmas gift, was a picture of me as a superhero. And the more that social media becomes kind of infiltrated with all these survivor stories, I just felt like me as a middle-aged, blonde, typical survivor, maybe I needed to up my game a little bit, so I got myself the costume. So, and it's funny, how often do you see a middle-aged fat lady in a superhero costume? So
Oh my darling,
You're-
you were so not the first part of that comment.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, yes, I am. Yes, I am. I'm 53 and I'm 200 pounds.
You know what? And
And
you
I'm okay
are,
with
and you are
that because I think
so-
I'm fabulous.
which you are. You know, you're so loved and you're so followed. I've been following, as you know, I've been following you, not stalking, following you for 5 years now, almost. And I follow you because you know what you're talking about, and you're such a stand for women and children all across, well, globally. So
Yeah.
I acknowledge you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Kathy, let's start with, can you just give us a short summary of how you got into this field? And also then, part two, what does the Mother Justice Network do? And who do they help?
Okay. Well, I am a survivor myself. I was in an abusive relationship starting when I was in high school. And that ended, technically ended in marriage and then divorce approximately 9 years later. I suffered every possible abuse that one could suffer within the context of an abusive relationship. And I very nearly did not make it out with my life and my daughter's lives. And so after suffering what I did, I just had this internal heartbeat. It took me a while to kind of get to a place of healing, but once I did, I just was determined that I just wanted to help one other woman from feeling so alone in those circumstances. And so I decided I wanted to volunteer. And it took me a while to find my local domestic violence crisis program. But once I did, I started out by becoming a host home for survivors. And then I volunteered in the office full time for 2 years. And then I became staff. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. A staff person left, and the executive director of my program said, well, would you like to step in temporarily? And 16 years later, I was still working there. So that's the short answer of how I got into advocacy work. And I can tell you, it wasn't just one woman. It's about 4,000 families later now that I am still helping women, children, and yes, even a few men. But I love the work that I do because I think it has the potential to be transforming for those survivors that I can have access with. One of my most favorite things to do, of course, are my retreats, my weekend retreats, where I have the capacity to kind of share the love, share the wisdom that I've gathered for 30 plus years in domestic violence survival and advocacy. I can share that with like 25 people at a time, and it just feels so efficient and so awesome to be able to share the information that I have. So that's how I started out. About 6 years ago now, I became very aware that local domestic violence programs were failing to meet the needs of victimized mothers and their children. And one of the reasons that was happening was because maybe about 12, 15 years ago, programs like United Way started demanding, how do I say this? Demanding that the funds that they were giving to programs were coming back fruitful. And so we had to start focusing our energies on putting our time and energy into proving that our programs were necessary and useful. And these programs, these funders wanted quick results, not necessarily good results. And so because when you are victimized by somebody that you were co-parenting with, and children are very powerful weapons to use against an adult victim, that victimization goes on until the youngest day, or until the day that the youngest child turns 18, and sometimes even beyond. So that does not, that's not conducive to quick results. And domestic violence programs started kind of focusing more on the restraining orders and the criminal hearings and the things that could be done quickly, and really kind of let the long-term child safety issues fall by the wayside. And it's really become disastrous for adult victims and child victims of domestic violence predators.
Thank you.
Kathy, can I ask you one follow-up question to that? I think many people are not clear on what components of abuse domestic violence encompasses. Can you give us the extensive list, because I know there's many abuses that domestic violence covers? It's not just physical abuse.
Yeah. So of course, domestic violence has many names. Domestic violence is probably the most known, but it encompasses really just a whole bunch of ideas: intimate partner abuse, domestic terrorism, coercive control. Sometimes I will even use family violence as an all-encompassing form of the same topic, but really it's all about how somebody in the context of an intimate relationship uses coercion and control up to and including violence in order to maintain their dominance over their intimate partner, either their current intimate partner or their former intimate partner. And intimate partner does not necessarily mean that there has to be sex. Like, there could be a dating relationship or even a cohabiting relationship, but that there's a level of intimacy that is beyond stranger, certainly. And so domestic violence and coercive control encompasses luring and grooming behaviors, and it includes exerting your privilege over your victim, and it includes emotional abuse, and it includes economic control and medical neglect, and it could include like isolation and deprivation and legal harassment and stalking, and there's just a whole realm of things far before we even get to the physical forms of abuse that is encompassed in this idea of domestic violence. And one of the things that everybody can remember, part of the definition of domestic violence includes the idea of PRIC, premeditated, repetitive, intentional, conscious, and knowing acts that a perpetrator does against the victim in order to really isolate and get that victim away from anything that looks like help, so they can be in constant control over that victim's life. Ultimately, it's a form of servitude that the abuser wants to maintain so much control over the adult victim's life. They want to really have somebody who will anticipate their every need, their every want, their every desire, and just kind of be in total service and servitude to them. And so that's really kind of the underpinnings of domestic violence and what happens in that intimate relationship.
Okay, that was really good. That acronym, I've not heard that before. Do you mind just repeating that once more for our viewers? Because I think that people will really, that will stick with them. That's a good one.
Yeah.
PRICK.
Yep. PRIC. P stands for premeditated. R stands for repetitive. I stands for intentional. C stands for conscious. So as an example, David Garvin, the trainer that I referenced earlier, during his training, he had mentioned that the only time abusers don't abuse is when they're asleep. And I had to raise my hand and I had to say, sorry, I actually have to contradict you on this, that my abuser would sleep with his fingers wrapped in my hair so that if I tried to get up to go to the bathroom, he would know. So even in their sleep, they have the capacity to find ways to abuse or control you. So C is conscious, and then K, knowing, and to be more specific about knowing, that it's knowing the victim's trauma triggers and her vulnerabilities. So, for instance, does that victim have a job, or does the perpetrator like sabotage her vehicle so that she can't get to appointments, or does she have, like, what kind of education does she have? I have found very frequently that my lack of college education is used against me, even in this world, in the domestic violence world, where judges will say that even though I've been doing this work for 25 years, that I'm not an expert. And kind of hard to imagine, I know, but I've definitely run into that more than once. And so, what are the vulnerabilities of the victim? And then the perpetrator will target those vulnerabilities in order to make her look crazy. I call it the she's a bitter, violent, lying, lazy, crazy, drunk, drug and money grub and slut defense. That's what abusers say about their victims, and they target their victims specifically to make them look that way.
Wow. Karen.
I can only imagine when they leave, because, well, I don't have to imagine, actually. I've been living it both through the victim, or through the abuser, and through the legal system. So we'll talk more about that later.
Yep.
So, unleashing superhero survivors from abuse via trauma-informed, survivor-centered advocacy. Can you please tell us what that means? What does trauma-informed mean?
Okay, so trauma-informed means that you, as a person who is assisting survivors, understands that there's no such thing as a perfect victim. That every victim comes to the table with survival skills and coping mechanisms that they have learned during the context of an abusive relationship in order to survive. And that you are far more likely to perceive the abuser as just this wonderful, outgoing, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Just very vivacious and
charismatic,
salubrious, like all of these wonderful, charismatic, is definitely one of them. In fact, the single most common adjective that I hear about abusers is charming. Okay. And so many of the women that I work with, or survivors that I work with, they actually are very hesitant on the idea of me meeting their abusers, because they're very certain that their abusers could charm me into believing that they're not, in fact, abusers. But that can't happen, because I know abusers by their priorities in life, and I will get to their priorities in a minute, but let's go back to the idea of charming. If you actually look up the word charming in the dictionary, it's not necessarily a nice thing. Yes, a house can be charming, which means it's cute and it's small and it might be well decorated or appointed, but when a person is charming, if you look through the entire definition, there starts to become this quality that means that they're deceptive, or that they're pulling the wool over your eyes. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily a nice thing to be called charming, right? And so, so many of the survivors that I work with will say, well, yeah, he started out charming, and of course he did, because he had to lure and groom you into that relationship to start with. If he had been who he was going to be from the very start, you would have been like, bye-bye, I have no time for you. Like, even when you kind of signed your name on the dotted line on that marriage contract, I'm very sure that he didn't say to you, just so you know, I'm going to be a prick. I'm going to be premeditated, repetitive, intentional, conscious, knowing, and I'm going to constantly demand your servitude to me. And can you sign here? I'm very sure, again, if they had said that to you, you would have been like, yeah, no, I'm not signing up for that. And you would have walked away. But just like child molesters lure and groom their child victims, domestic violence predators lure and groom their adult victims too. The cycle of violence from Lenore Walker from many years ago kind of talked about the honeymoon phase part of the cycle of violence. And I think most professionals recognize that that's kind of outdated, but I recognize that the honeymoon phase was actually that act of a perpetrator luring and grooming the victim. Then, when there is this explosion, the abuser's like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. It won't happen again. I'll go for counseling. I'll do this. I'll do that. And none of that is an actual offer or a valid offer to change. The only reason abusers do that is to try to hook and lure you back into the relationship because they understand they've gone too far. So, oh gosh, I kind of lost my train of thought there, but yeah,
that's
so
okay. We were talking about that. What does trauma-informed, survivor-centered advocacy mean?
There we go.
However, everything you've said is very important, for people to understand.
It's so easy for me to get off track. So trauma-informed. So we talk about how nice the abusers always are. The victims very often come across as angry, belligerent, resistant, uncooperative. In fact, I've had survivors that I've worked with who have called me a fat cunt. And I've had, yeah, absolutely. And the issue is not that they're calling me that. The issue is, in what context does that happen, right? And so if I'm not a trauma-informed provider, I'm going to listen to that person calling me a fat cunt and say, well, screw you. I don't need to deal with this. Bye-bye. But a trauma-informed professional will say, okay, what are the circumstances here? What's going on? Oh, she's in court and I see her decompensate every time she's in court. She gets anxious, she gets edgy, she gets just kind of irritable. And even in the hours and the days leading up to it, when she's preparing for court, she gets anxious and upset. So I could recognize as a trauma-informed professional that name calling was just kind of her releasing all of this poisonous agitation that had just been building up in her body. And I could say, okay, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to think about that. I'm going to run to the bathroom, come back, and we'll talk about why it is that you're continuing to feel so anxious right now. And just kind of remove myself from the situation, give that victim time to come down and release, and then re-engage that victim. It also means understanding that, for instance, survivors often self-medicate with alcohol and or street drugs and or prescribed drugs. And it doesn't mean that they're, that they're a junkie or whatever else. It just means that's the immediate means that they have to promote their well-being when the wash cycle in their brain is just spinning, and they need to stop it. It's the best way that they have to stop. In reality, survivors take on a lot of destructive and unhealthy ways to relate to people while they're in relationship. And it's not because it's who they are, it's because of the extreme circumstances that either the abuser themselves or the circumstances lead them to kind of take on functions that could be disruptive or dysfunctional in healthy relationships. But abuse is never healthy, not even a little bit. And so I think, should applaud survivors for their survival skills, even the ones that seem less functional to the normal world.
So trauma-informed people like yourself, they do not take those kind of comments personally because they understand it's not about you, it's about them. It's about the victim and what they're going through. So you don't take it personally. So when we see you next Tuesday, it's not even about you.
Well, depending on context, I find it a great compliment when opposing parties call me a cunt. I have no problem with that. That means that
compliment. Because
it means that I'm doing my job very well.
Exactly.
I I have a story for another time, but we probably don't have time here. But yeah, I have a T-shirt that says "I'm the dyke on the fucking committee," and that shirt was made so that I could do child exchanges with one of my opposing parties. And he did not like that at all.
You could probably keep us on here for days with your stories.
Yeah. But trauma-informed goes beyond that. It's also being able to not just recognize that survivors are often, not always, but often difficult to work with, but also the ability to talk them down and to give them the safe space that they need to be able to talk about what they've been through, to be believed, and ultimately to allow them to release every act of abuse. It acts as a poison on that woman's body or on that person's body. And for somebody to feel validated in their experiences and to be able to share what's been happening without any questioning or countering, it's a very healing experience. And one of the ways that I know that I'm talking to a victim, by the way, in case anybody's interested, a couple of things. The first thing that I experienced is that the victim, once they understand that I'm a safe person, they do what I call verbal vomiting. They just, they spill their story and they don't stop until either I stop or they stop. Like it just goes on and on. And in fact, one of the first survivors I've ever worked with, Laureen, if you're out there, I still love you, babe. My first contact with her was 12 hours from 8 o'clock in the morning to 8 o'clock at night, that she just spilled her guts and I just let her do it. So verbal vomiting, and then rabbit holing. You actually just saw a little bit of rabbit holing earlier. As I said, I'm a survivor. Rabbit holing is where a survivor will start telling a story, and then in her mind, she goes, oh, wait, in order for this person to understand this story, they actually need to know what happened over here. And so she'll jump over to another story to kind of clear that up. And then goes, oh, wait, but in order to understand this story over here, they need to understand this piece over here. And so they jump and jump and jump and jump. And often survivors, more often than not, can't find their way back to the original story, which is what you saw earlier when I was like, oh, crap.
Very interesting. I've never heard anybody talk about that before.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
So let's talk about
the people who are not abusers. They cannot imitate that.
No.
It's
So let's
like purging, and
It's
your
purging.
mind is spinning, right?
exactly.
So
So let's talk about the word high conflict.
Okay.
High conflict divorce. This word is a hotbed for misinterpretation. High
Yes.
conflict is not two spouses equally fighting.
Yes.
High
And in
conflict
fact,
is
yeah,
a
high
power
conflict is a
imbalance.
misnomer. It should not be called high conflict.
shouldn't-
Every high conflict case I have ever seen has always been domestic violence.
Yeah.
Now, is it possible that there are two people who are just so, like the War of the Roses, if you ever saw that movie
Yes.
in the late 1980s, where two people are so hell-bent on each other's destruction? I guess it's possible. But in order for that to happen, you have to have two parties who are on absolutely equal footing, and neither party is afraid of the other. And that is really key. If you have one party, as soon as you have one party that is afraid of the other, then there's domestic violence involved, and you have to figure out who the perpetrator is and who the victim is. But if there's no fear, it's not domestic abuse.
I find
High
it very
conflict.
interesting.
Sorry, go ahead. High
I was-
conflict as a divorce mechanism, it doesn't exist. It's domestic violence related.
now,
I
do
find
you
it very
also-
interesting that the courts use that term. Sorry, ladies. I find it very interesting that the courts use that term. And I have actually told a couple of professionals in the past that high conflict is not what it is at all. But, have you ever addressed that in court?
I'll tell you, I believe my understanding, or why I think that it has come to be known as high conflict, is because once in the late early 1970s, late 1970s, when our states and provinces started changing the parameters around how you could file for divorce. Before the 1960s, let's say, you had to have fault grounds for divorce, whether it was adultery or excessive drinking or cruelty, et cetera, et cetera.
Sorry, Kathy, your volume is just gone down a little bit. I know you haven't done anything, but it just has reduced.
Is this better?
Keep going. We can hear you. It's just, it'll probably adjust itself.
Okay. So in the 1960s, before our states started changing laws to allow for no fault or irreconcilable difference divorces, you had to have fault grounds in order to divorce. And so many women were in fact stuck because for whatever reason, they didn't have exactly what they needed in order to be able to file for a fault divorce, but they just knew that they were miserable and unhappy in the relationships that they were in. So, and in fact, I think the statistics are, if I remember correctly, about 70%, 69 or 70% of divorce filings are actually filed by women who, by and large, go for that no fault divorce. Because it's the easiest divorce to gain, except for the problem is when there's no fault divorce, then both parties are seen equally as being the problem in the relationship. And that's why I think high conflict, the term high conflict has come about, because, well, if both parties are equally taking responsibility for the breakdown of the relationship and they won't stay out of court, they keep coming back and back and back and back and back, well, then it must be both parties' fault. And I think that attorneys largely have done a huge disservice to victims of domestic violence, because I still run into it now where attorneys will press the victims that I'm working with to file no fault divorces because that's the easiest thing to do. And I'm saying, but wait a minute, when you file no fault divorce, when there's going to be parenting issues down the road because an abuser is going to drag that adult victim back until the day the youngest child turns 18, the mother is going to be seen equally as at fault, or the primary caretaking parent is going to be seen equally as at fault here. And that's going to do really bad things for child custody down the road. Mm-hmm. So from like, that's my understanding of how that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Dr. Jennifer Harmond has done a lot of studies on this, and she speaks about high conflict divorce is actually post-separation abuse.
Yep.
And it's not about two equal parties warring with one another, as you said with the War of the Roses. It's more about a significant power imbalance of one person having all the power and the other parent having no power.
No power. Yep.
And the person, the parent, with no power is not reciprocating the parental alienating behaviors.
That's right.
It's very different. To understand post-separation abuse, which all of us went through, and any victim will go through if you have domestic violence on the table. I think that's very important to understand, and particularly for judges, lawyers, and healthcare.
And here's the thing: the court officers have zero incentive to get this high conflict to come to an end, because as long as they can keep these parties at conflict, quote unquote, then they have a funding stream. They can get their summer home, they can get their pool, they can get their Ferrari, they can get whatever they want, as long as they can keep these families in the court system. And so what they do is they dump the children in the laps of the abusive parent, because they know the abusive parent has all the financial resources that they want to keep this going, and they know that the adult victim is going to ruin, absolutely devastate her financial future in an effort to save her children. And so it's very easy to just dump them on the perpetrator, and the perpetrator is happy. Like, he doesn't care who gets his money as long as it's not the adult victim. And I say all the time, abusers will spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees to prove that they can't afford tens of thousands in child support. And I just see that playing over time and time again in the family court system. And it's really disgusting because you know, there's the attorneys themselves, there's the mental health professionals, there's the evaluators and the parenting coordinators and the mediators, and like all these people who have their fingers in the pot, and not one of them are going to be willing to get this family to come to a place of resolution, because then that funding stops.
Exactly. Exactly. And I'll tell you that, you know, there's many cases that Kim and I can cite where it's not that the father or, you know, the abuser necessarily has more money or more resources, that, you know, they still, I find that it's the lawyers, and then the judges collude with the lawyers and they drag it out for years.
Yep.
You know?
Somebody has to have financial resources somewhere, and sometimes that means that either party is going to family or, you know, to friends or
Exactly.
GoFundMe pages, whatever. Whatever. Like I've seen survivors who are told, "Well, go get a credit card," and they're going literally hundreds of thousands of dollars into debt. Like I don't want to talk about other people's private situations, but I know of women who have spent more in legal fees than the value of the house that I live in. And to me, that is just disgusting, absolutely disgusting, because one of the ways that I know how to determine whether something is high conflict versus domestic violence is who was the first to file a reduction in child support, and how early on in the case did that happen? Because I know that as soon as somebody says, "Hey, I can't afford these children," that in a domestic violence case, that is when it's like game on. The abuser is going to take that and run with it, and that's when he's going to fight for custody of the kids, even though they might not have wanted custody before. It's once somebody says either I can't afford the child support, I don't want to pay it anymore, or I need more child support because I can't make ends meet on what I have. That filing of child support change is what generates the abuser to say, "Okay, I'm going after custody of my kids."
So, Kathy, when we experience family terrorism, we'll just put it under that umbrella, family terrorism, if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah.
There is a victim and there is a perpetrator.
Yes.
So can you explain the characteristics of a perpetrator, and do they all follow the same patterns of behavior?
They all follow very similar patterns of behavior. And so earlier I talked about PRIC. Now I'm going to tell you about, I know who predators are by their priorities in their lives. And the first priority that they have is they themselves and them. Their needs, their goals, their desires, their wants, their image in particular is very important to them. Now, a lot of people, just a side note, a lot of people will use the term narcissistic abuse. And even though I appreciate where that comes from, I don't use that term myself. And the reason I don't use that term is because narcissism is a diagnosable personality disorder. And in fact, most abusers test very well in psychological testing. And it's very rare for an abuser to actually be diagnosed as narcissistic. I am not a mental health professional. I don't have any credentials, but I do know that if you have a narcissist, that narcissist is narcissistic with everybody in the community, not just the adult victim. And so for me, domestic violence is just that. It's an abuser who's making a choice, knows how to turn on and turn off his behavior because he isn't equally abusive with everybody around him, really just primarily the adult victim. And when he no longer has that adult victim to abuse, then they often move on to the children or to a new victim. So their first priority, they themselves and them. Their second priority is money. Your money is his money is his money. If you have parents who die and leave you money, their money is his money. Your children, if they're working, their money is his money. He just wants to absorb all the financial resources around him. Next on the list is the toys, the material things, his house, his cars, his boat, his ATV, his RV, like everything is about his things. So much so that I went to court with a survivor one time whose abuser was going after half of the value of her sewing machine, $25, and he got it. The judge awarded it to him.
That's extreme.
But listen, I went to court just a couple of weeks ago where the abuser wanted to go back into this family had been separated for a significant period of time, like at least 3 years. And the abuser wanted to be able to go back into the marital home, even though they'd been separated. And he wanted to be able to, okay, you pick a spatula, I'll pick a spatula. You pick a TV, I'll pick a TV. You pick a bed. And they wanted to go through the house and separate out the entire house like that. And thank God the woman's attorney is like, I am not sitting here in the house and separating out every piece of silverware. That is ridiculous. But it gets that ridiculous. Okay, so the things are what's important next. Then after that are the flying monkeys, the people that the abuser has been able to groom out in the community to believe that he's this really great guy, this really awesome person. They're not necessarily friends, because I don't know that abusers have the capacity to build true friendship. They go into every relationship with the mindset of what's in it for me. And so as an example, my abuser, when something bad would happen to his friends, he would kind of gloat and laugh about it. And I'd be like, wow, that's really crappy of you. Like, they need your support and your compassion right now. And you're just like saying what a dick they are,
Yes.
Makes you the dick.
Yeah.
Often the flying monkeys will be the children as well, correct?
Yeah. Yes. And for me, I hesitate to use the flying monkeys term on kids until they become adults with the capacity of being able to think for themselves. I really wouldn't use that term on the children beforehand. It is true that children align easily with the abuser because they see the power, and they see like that when they align with the abuser, they get what they want from the abuser. They get praise, they get, hey, you're doing a great job. They get the things that, especially for anything beyond a teenager, like from 12 on up, getting those things that the abuser can often give them that the victim often can't afford. Those are very powerful pulls for kids. So it's very common for me to see children who are aligned with the abuser, which is very, very sad. But I don't call them flying monkeys until they're adults and they have the capacity to think for themselves.
But even when they're in, sorry, Kathy, I was going to say, even when they're still, when they become young adults, I don't see them as being able to see for themselves because they're still involved in an abusive relationship. They're still being controlled and dominated, and they're still living inside of a fear that they have been conditioned to live inside of for many years. So I don't see them as being able to think for themselves until potentially something significant happens and it snaps them into a bit of reality or helps to wake them up. Would you agree?
Yeah. Well, that is true, but I also see a lot of adult children who just have learned to take on the attitudes and the belief systems of their abuser. They get the power that the abuser had, and they enjoy it. And
absolutely.
They move on. So yeah, it's really unfortunate because I have so many survivors that I work with who have adult children that don't have an ongoing relationship with them, and it's very painful to watch that process happen. But at some point in time, I do think that once you're an adult, you are responsible for changing the dynamics of who you are as a human being. Like, it's time for you to either continue the damage that has been done, or for you to recognize, hey, this was dysfunctional, and it's my responsibility as an adult to kind of figure out where this comes from and how can I change back. And I can give you a personal example of that. Like growing up, my own mom was abusive, and I would consider my father my mother's adult victim. And my mom was not physically abusive to me, but my oldest sister would identify that she was physically abusive to her. And our mother would like terrorize us when she was angry or pissed off at us for any reason. Like she could eviscerate us emotionally, and that included my dad. And but in the process of my own healing, I read this really awesome book called Family Secrets by John Bradshaw, I think the author's name is. And because of that book, I was able to kind of pick out the cookie crumbs from my childhood that it hit me one day. Holy crap, my mom was a victim of my grandfather, her father. And I instinctively came to understand, and she confirmed for me much later, that my grandfather had sexually abused her as a child, and that he went on to physically assault her. And my grandfather was an equal opportunity rapist. Like he didn't just rape her, he raped every female in the family that he had access to. And even his own son, I should say. And so like, we're understanding that, making that connection, all of a sudden there were so many things that were explained about my mom that I was like, holy shit. Like it didn't necessarily absolve her of what she had done, but it certainly made me understand that it was informing how I was acting as a parent to my own daughter.
Yes.
And saying to myself, I am responsible for changing this now. Now that I understand where it comes from, I'm responsible for changing this, and then moving forward and creating a new family dynamic. It wasn't my fault that my mom had been abusive to me, but it was my responsibility to recognize where the harm had come from, that I was moving it on to the next generation, and it was up to me to stop it.
Yes, I think it's so important when people can come to, when survivors can come to the point where they can look at the generational cycles of abuse and start to recognize where it's come from. And as you said with your mom, all behavior does make sense if only you realize the history from which it has come.
Right. And so for as difficult as my relationship was with my mom growing up, I just have nothing but compassion for her now, because she raised 4 daughters who are fully functioning, like, citizens of the United States who have gone on to do things wonderfully in their lives. And we've all struggled in various ways with relationship, but like the fact that my mom was able to release 4 daughters into the world was really quite amazing when you understand what happened to her. Like she learned from the age of 12 on that no man in her world was safe. And so that she could go on and have, I mean, I say that my dad was abused by my mom, but my mom and dad were married for 52 years before she had the mental breakdown that separated them. Like they had a life that they would identify as happy, even though I can identify from the outside looking in that it was not necessarily a healthy one.
Well, it becomes normalized, and that's all they know. So that's all they know.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
So Kathy, you have created this very innovative and effective app for abuse victims called Justice Tips. Can you please tell us about this? It's fascinating.
Okay. I want to ask a question first, because I think we're over our 30 minutes, aren't we?
Oh,
here?
We're so lucky.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if we can actually make that a separate.
Yeah, absolutely.
You bet. You bet. Yeah.
Because that, like, I could actually do an actual walkthrough of the app for people who are interested in, but I will synopsize it to say that my app, I think it can be game changer. I'm so excited for people to like reach out and start using it because I really think it could be a game changer for how our communities respond to victims of domestic violence. This app is designed to allow survivors to rate every professional they come in contact with based on their trauma-informed responsiveness. Okay, so you can rate your judge, you can rate your attorney, you can rate your guardian ad litem or your child's attorney, you can rate your mental health professionals, the local police department, your local domestic violence crisis center, literally everybody. You can rate your postman if you want to. Everybody on their trauma responsiveness to you as a survivor. And so the way the ratings happen, you don't just assign a random number, you have to answer questions on what trauma-informed practice looks like in regards to this provider, and you're answering yes or no to these questions determines the rating that this professional would get. And if they're a trauma-informed practitioner like myself, then they're going to get a very high rating. And if they suck at being trauma responsiveness, then they're going to get a very low rating. And the thing is, like, if they get a very low rating, let me give you an example. If they get a low rating and you say to yourself, well, like their rating is very low, but they deserve better. So as an example, I have an attorney that I work with locally very often. And I recommend him to my clients a lot because he has the bedside manner of a flea. Like he just wants his money and he just wants the facts. He doesn't want to get into the warm and fuzzy. And I'll say to my survivor, like, hey, if you want the warm and fuzzy at the meeting with the attorney, bring me along, okay? But he gets the results that my clients need. He gets like the vast majority of time for parenting for my survivors, and you know he will help craft a parenting plan that limits the amount of time that the adults have to be in contact with each other and that kind of thing. So I find he's really effective at what he does, even though he's not even a little bit trauma informed. So even though he would rate low on the trauma informedness, when you rate him on the app, you could give him a higher rating based on the fact that I wouldn't recommend him for trauma informed, but I do recommend him because he does a good job, kind of thing. So,
and at the end of the day, a lawyer that does a good job and actually gets the job done and protects the client is exactly what we need.
Right. Yeah.
So our audience will be very happy to hear that Kathy has agreed to do a 4-part series with us on some very specific issues. One of them talking about her app. We're going to do one on coercive control. We're going to do one on counter-parenting, one on being a superhero survivor, and perhaps another one on selecting a lawyer. There's so many topics. Anyway,
listen, I'll come back as often as you want me to come back. Like there's no limit here. So
the topics are exhaustive.
Kathy, you've been amazing. Thank you so much for being with us today. You're so informative, and the work that you're doing with women and children is so commendable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.